Interviews are the backbone of so many documentaries. Done right, they can provide structure, give an audience access to someone's interior experience, and heighten a story's sense of immediacy, relevance, and emotional weight. But interviews are also very easy to mess up. There have been so many times in my career I've been pumped for an interview, finally landed it, only to finish filming and think, oof, that did not go how I'd hoped. But I've also had the opposite experience, interviews that leave me speechless, that bring the story to another level. And in this video, I'm gonna go over 5 common mistakes that filmmakers make when it comes to interviews. I'll start with some interviewing techniques, move on to some gear considerations, and at the end, I'll share a bonus interviewing tip that Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times journalist Nicholas Kristof once gave to me that has helped me so much when working on emotionally complex stories. So let's get into it. Hey everyone, I'm Austin Meyer. I'm a documentary filmmaker, National Geographic Explorer, and on this channel, I share the field-tested skills, mindsets, and lessons that have helped me on my journey as a documentary filmmaker. I recently shot a documentary for The North Face about an ultra-running athlete competing in a 100-mile foot race. The project had 2 main interviews, and even though they were shot just days apart with mostly the same equipment, one felt meh, and one felt great. And as I reflected on why that happened, I started thinking about just how many things we have to get right when it comes to filming documentary interviews. Especially if you shoot solo or in small teams like I do a lot. The video, the audio, the lights, the location, the questions, the listening, the responding. Sometimes it feels like there are endless possible mistakes we can make. But in the context of all those mistakes possible, I think focusing on these 5 can go a long way. The first big mistake I see people making when it comes to interviewing is not understanding a participant's role in the film before conducting the interview. A lot of people will talk about interview prep in the context of preparing your questions, writing them down, all that kind of stuff. But what I don't see people talking about is really understanding the role of your participant in the larger picture of your film. For example, documentary stories have a bunch of different forms of sound bites, moments of exposition, or background information on the characters and setting, moments of emotional honesty, moments of reflection, which can give the story more stakes. These sound bites can come from a range of different people who have a different proximity to the story you're telling. So are they experiencing it firsthand? Are they an observer? Are they a friend, a subject matter expert? You need to think about all this before you do your interview. Don't just approach everyone you're interviewing with the same types of questions. Think about what types of quotes the person you're interviewing is best suited to provide. If you're talking to someone who thinks big picture, ask them big picture questions like what this story says about the human condition in general. Is the person funny? Are they wise? Are they reflective? Consider all of these qualities when you're thinking about the role they will play in the story, and thus what kind of questions you can ask to get the best sound bites from them. A perfect example of this is the Oscar-winning documentary Free Solo. In that movie, we have a story with incredible plot and extreme physical and emotional stakes, but the person at the center of the story, Alex Honnold, is not really a talker. So what the filmmakers do is they let Alex Honnold talk about climbing, his friends, his family, and his relationship from his logical brain. And then they interviewed people around him, like his girlfriend and the filmmakers, to express feelings that Alex could not. This is an example of understanding the role of your participant in the context of the larger story. But once you've got that figured out, the next mistake I see filmmakers make during interviews is not giving interview participants anything to react to other than questions. I want my interviews to feel as much like a natural conversation as it can when someone has cameras and a mic and lights pointed at them. If that lines up with what you want your interviews to feel like, then you can't suddenly go into interrogation mode when the red lights go on. You can't just ask question after question and expect an interview participant to show up like they do with a friend. Think about giving people some different elements to react to in an interview. You can tell a personal story of your own. This works especially well if you want your interviewee to open up and tell you something real. Chances are, if you tell a personal story, they will tell one in response. It's human nature. It will help you both relax enough to have a real conversation where you just react to each other's reactions. Then think back to my first point about the role someone plays in a story. If you want to encourage someone to give you details, funny quotes, emotional quotes, or anything else, behave that way. If you want a professor you are interviewing to have some grand theory, try throwing out a grand theory of your own, modeled behavior. And then that professor will probably respond with a better or corrected grand theory because they are the experts. Lastly, don't be afraid to just break the normal question and answer pattern of interviews. Tell people to close their eyes and reflect, or play an improv game with them before the interview begins. Just be a human being, which means share part of yourself, model behavior, mirror behavior, so that your interview participant can relax into who they truly are, not what they think a documentary participant should be. That leads me to my third mistake I see filmmakers make, which is having someone too close to the participant conduct the interview. Now, this is a tricky one because documentaries benefit so much when you or your team have intimate access to the person you're interviewing. You might be best friends, you might be a family member, and that can be awesome. But be cautious, because based on the role you want someone to play in the story, it might be a mistake to have the person conducting the interview be too close to them. If I was gonna make a documentary about one of my best friends, Hunter, I would likely bring someone in to conduct the portion of the interview about his background. That is because I already know it. And Hunter knows I already know it. So this often sets an inauthentic tone if I were to ask the questions. Whereas if you had someone who genuinely didn't know Hunter's backstory, both the questions and the answers would feel more real. This has been a big learning for me when working on projects, especially in countries where I don't speak the language, because sometimes due to budgetary constraints, I've had to ask a family member to conduct the interviews. And when they're asking questions like, where did you grow up? The whole thing just feels off. And this actually came up in an interview I did on my podcast called the Austin Meyer Podcast with the team behind the Oscar-winning My Octopus Teacher. So have a listen here.
That was a really important part of the process, was to have the first time I asked him about things, the first time he was telling me anything, was that we were recording it. You kind of nervously try and get all the information beforehand because you want to know what it is you're going to get and what to focus on. But it's always a real mistake because you're then going back into that environment and you're getting them to act because they know the answers to those questions.
So you know the role of the interview participant, you're giving them different things to react to, and you're not too close to the story for it to appear inauthentic. At that point, you gotta make sure that you're not making the location and gear mistake of not being in control of light. When you're interviewing as a solo shooter or in a small team, the last thing that you wanna be doing is worrying about changes in your gear and changes to your lighting conditions. You wanna choose a setup that allows you to put all your focus on the interview. That's why I recommend choosing an interview location where you are in maximum control possible of the light. This doesn't mean you have your own lights necessarily. I didn't own a key light for the first 3 years of my freelance filmmaking career, but it does mean you need to be strategic about picking your location. Based on how long you anticipate your interview being, choose a location with lighting conditions that won't change drastically as the sun moves or the weather changes. Here's an example of an interview I shot for a story for Polar USA about NFL safety Taylor Rapp. I was shooting and conducting this interview alone. You can see that I used natural window light as my key light and shut the blinds behind her. Even though the image looked nicer with the blinds open, because we started with an overcast day, I closed them because if the sun came out, suddenly the background would look super bright and washed out. I didn't want to be thinking or worried about those lighting conditions changing while conducting the interview. Same thought process goes for outdoor interviews, where lighting conditions can change quickly. Check out the Sunseeker app, which can show you where in the sky the sun will be at different times of the day. Just know that the shade is your friend. I will take a flatter image over a more shaped and dynamic image if it means I can truly focus on the interview at hand and not be worried about camera settings and exposure. Another thing I don't want to be worried about is audio, which leads me to the next mistake, which is not using a boom mic. This is one I took way too long to learn. Now, of course, there are scenarios where using a lav mic is preferred or the only way to go. But so many interviews can be shot with a boom mic. And for years, I just stuck with lav mics for interviews because I didn't want to deal with the extra cables and stands or even just like figure it out. But now that I look back, what I gained in terms of staying light with my gear, I lost in focus on the interview. That's because when someone is wearing a lav mic, and that's the only source of audio I have, I'm always so conscious of any little clothes rustling or static from the lav cable. There's so many interviews I've done as a solo shooter where I have half my attention on the interview, half my attention on my headphones, listening so intently to see if there's anything scratching. And even worse, when there is interference or scratching from the lav mic, I have to pause the interview, then go up to the participant and readjust the mic, and it just breaks the entire flow of the interview. That's why if you have the means to get a boom mic set up, I highly recommend it. Because once you get your mic set up and the level set, like this mic right above me right here, it's pretty much rock solid. And you can focus on the good stuff, which is the story. The money spent on whatever your boom setup will be, which I can go into in another video if you're curious to see mine, is so worth it in the presence that you can have during the interview. So now you know the mistakes not to make. But for a bonus tip in the other direction, I want to share something Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof once told me during a reporting trip to Nepal. That tip is to understand the power dynamics of an interview, and in particular stories, take time up front to make sure the participant knows they are in control. Kristof told me this back in 2015 while we were reporting on some very emotionally sensitive stories in Nepal. Specifically, we were doing reporting on human trafficking and were at a safe house for young women who had been rescued. Going into one of our first interviews, I watched as Kristof spent 20 minutes before the interview trying to shift the balance of power in the room. He told the young woman who he was, where he was from, where the story was going to go, what his goals were. They talked through anonymity and pseudonym choices. And then Kristof made sure to say, you are in control of the conversation. If at any point you want to stop the interview or not be a part of this story, you say so. If you don't want to answer a question, you don't have to. You can take breaks. You can ask me anything. You are in control. Now, Kristof wouldn't say this if we were working on a story about politicians in power, so it is dependent on context. But the sense of power dynamics is still so important to understand. When we come into an interview with a notepad or cameras or mics, we come with a power and a privilege. And that power balance can make people feel like they have to answer questions or behave in a certain way. But it is neither ethical nor does it yield the best material when an interview is extractive. The best interviews come when there is this sense of shared control, when a participant understands that they have power and agency. So I hope you found this helpful. That's it for this video, the first on my channel about the art and craft of documentary filmmaking. And if you enjoyed it, please hit that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. And until that next one, go out and tell some stories.